Welcome to an analysis of transformational Leitmotific-Counterpoint in Wagner's Tristan and Isolde. Let's start by pinpointing who this video is primarily for and what you might get out of it. This video will have exponential value depending on how familiar you already are with the work of Tristan and Isolde in a purely musical sense. I'm not trying to discourage anyone from partaking in this analysis, but I want to preface that this work should be heard in its entirety before engaging in this type of deconstruction. Since we're primarily going to analyze transformation of leitmotifs and contrapuntal synthesis of said leitmotifs, the better your relationship is to the material in question, the more and easier you'll be able to pierce through the surface structure into the music. So why would you want to investigate how this music is put together? Well, purely from an experiential standpoint, listening to a musical surface structure while simultaneously being able to decipher all of its constituent parts and be aware of where they are derived from enhances the experience from a passive receiving of the music to an active participation in the listening experience, which highly increases the pleasure of listening. But it's also interesting from a purely analytical perspective to maybe learn a bit about how composers create multiplicity out of limited material. It invites a listening style beneficial to all music, not only this particular work, and can thus be both useful and enjoyable. We will start simple, with variations mainly based on instrumentation, dynamics, and character, to then gradually move on to more invasive and complex changes to pitches and rhythm, and where the fact of leitmotific simultaneity becomes the point of focus. Sometimes to the point where if you didn't know that two examples were related, you might not pick up on that relationship your first couple of listens. All materials in this video will be named with letters and a corresponding color, this to avoid confusion. Although some might argue that this increases confusion, the reason why I'm doing this is because the A motif, for example, have more names than I care to recite here, but some are the yearning motif, longing motif, the Isolde motif, prelude motif, desire motif, and so on. So here it will be called A. Let's start with the Tristan chord. If you want a video that goes deep into both the harmonic and historic aspects of this chord and how it might have come to be, I would suggest you watch the music professor's video on the topic. It's by far the best video on the subject on YouTube. I will link it in the description. For our purposes, diving into the functionality or correct numeral analysis of the chord, although interesting, is not the type of activity we're going to be dealing with in this video. I'm also going to cover the chord quite quickly because I want to get into analyzing other motifs that I think are less known, deserving of attention, and arguably subject to greater transformation. But the chord is very recognizable, so let's start with it nonetheless. For our purposes, it's enough to point out that the Tristan chord is sitting in between and interlocking two leitmotifs, namely B, that sinks into the chord, and A, that emerges out of it in the top voice. Sometimes in the opera, the chord appear with only one of the motifs conjoining the Tristan chord, other times the chord appear in isolation. First, let's look at an example of this chord played by the full orchestra, where it's very recognizable. The harmony is fully blended here, meaning that all the pitches of the Tristan chord is sounding in every section of the orchestra, and it's found early in the love duet of the second act. Notice how much air and space is generated by the arpeggiating harp, violas, and cellos succeeding the Tristan chord, reintroducing momentum after the roaring chord. In the third act, we hear this particular inversion of the chord, presented in a rhythmically ambiguous manner. It's played in the low register of the clarinet family with the help of a horn. The sound produced has a particular hollow and shallow and deprived quality, and I for one did not identify this as the Tristan chord the first time I heard the section, even though it's sounding from the woodwind section just like the first chord in the first prelude. But the fact that there are no double reeds and that the registration is so low, particularly in the single-reeded family, completely altered the identity of the sound. It's one of my favorite adaptations of this chord in isolation, pulsating as if the essence of life was a dying source of light, losing connection to its supply of energy. Next, let's look at a modulatory process instead of examining the chord in isolation. In this example, as is so very often in this opera, the harmonic direction towards the tonic A, hinted at by the Tristan chord and the following E dominant, is subverted by a quick sidestep to the mediant F sharp minor, via insertion of a C sharp 7. The stepwise voice leading in the lowest horn and double basses helps smooth out the deceptive cadence. After arriving at a quick F sharp minor, this same process is repeated from F sharp, but with a modulatory variation leading us to G minor. Later, that same surface structure repeats, but with an oscillation between the Tristan chord and the E dominant, until an enharmonic respelling of the last F into a E sharp leads again to F sharp minor. When that sequence repeats, see if you can pierce through the surface structure and hear the altered B motif in the cellos and English horn. I think we are ready to look at some more dramatic transformations now. In the beginning of the third act, the Tristan chord is presented in a unique inversion and rejects its functionality as a predominant chord, which is the way it most often functions throughout the opera. Here, it is resolved instantly to what is probably the most depressive F minor chord in all of music. If what followed the question, which is the Tristan chord in the first prelude, was yet another question in the form of a dominant hinting at possibility and the future, this is where that question gets its answer. The loyal A material has accustomed itself to its new desolate harmonic landscape, no longer chromatic, but neutralized to F Aeolian. The A material is initiated on the note G, the lowest note of the violin, and thus an open string. That eliminates the possibility of vibrato, which is almost a must to give music like this life and color. Wagner consciously prohibits that by this registration and forces the note, whether performers or conductors want it or not, into an inescapable place of numbness and death. This music is no longer tonal. The plagal cadence we hear, with its resounding parallel fifths, is completely comfortable with its lack of momentum. Modality has completely taken over, and it's about to become a lot worse. Let's look only a page later, after a couple of gradual changes has altered this sequence. In the bass, we now hear an ominous descending augmented triad, and the texture is more contrapuntal, with the addition of a retrograde inversion of a seemingly new material in the horn, doubled by a bassoon. If you're an avid Wagnerian, you might be able to instantly recognize its origins, but for now, try to focus on the diffusion of the Tristan chord and how it interacts with the A material. Let's drop in about halfway through the third act. The same material we just heard reappears in thicker instrumentation. The rhythms have all been diminished, quickening the sequence. The augmented triad is still here in the lower register, but the A material is reshaped into an octatonic sonority, blending the contour of the original chromatic phrase and the diatonic version we just observed. Please note the gnarly, stop-muted sforzando in the horn on the first beat of each bar. This is musical transformation of the highest order. Let's listen to all of them, side by side, to get greater insight into this variational masterwork. We will leave our investigation of the transformational quality of the Tristan chord here, although we could cover hundreds of examples, one more striking than the next. But we want to look at more material, so we better get going. I want to add here that although we frequently will return to the prelude as a point of reference, none of these motifs presented there should be regarded as definitive originals from which all subsequent developments merely derive. Rather, each variation or thematic emergence, whether in the prelude, the love duet, or the final act, should be understood as one moment in the broader ongoing process of transformation. The material is not fixed, it's alive, unfolding through continuous recontextualization and reinterpretation across the opera. Let's backtrack and start with the first unique material appearing in the prelude of the first act following the introduction. This is the main leitmotif, subject to continual variation in the prelude. For reference, let's look at its first three permutations. The first statement, then repeated a third higher, with the last note descending a major second instead of a minor seventh. And the third one following the same diatonic contour, but with the appoggiatura emitted, setting up for an ascending minor seventh leap to give momentum for the line's continual development. We could go on discussing its local variations, but let's find it elsewhere in the opera, taking other roles, and maybe look at the result of fusing it with other leitmotifs. In the first instrumental statement of the first act, we find it not as a lyrical melody, as in the prelude, but as a musical gesture. Here the notes are altered to fit a diminished harmony, and the tempo is much quicker. The material is stated 3 times, overlapping one another, and each repetition an octave higher than the last. Here is the original as appearing in the prelude for reference. And here in the first act. Further into the first act, we hear this wonderful amalgamation. Part of the C material is emitted and conjoined with a rhythmically altered A material. What is left of the C material is its characteristic appoggiatura and original descending minor seventh. It can be tough to discern in a first hearing, but try to follow the oboe and Isolde's voice. Next, we want to look at a similar example, but instead of the conjoinment of 2 materials into a line, here we actually experience synthesis of new material as a consequence of interlocking 2 full leitmotifs into what is heard as a new one. But to hear that, we have to familiarize ourselves with a new motif that will be the other partner of this union, because we can't fully hear the fusion if we don't intimately know and understand its parts. Please bear with me. This is the material that will be fused with the C motif. Versions of this material can be found already in the first prelude, but it's brought to the forefront of the musical surface in this form firstly in the second act, and is greatly explored, especially in the third act. Let's look at Tristan's first climax in the third act, where it's represented both in the upper woodwinds and sung by Tristan. Earlier in this section, we hear it climbing through the woodwinds, continually transposed by the interval of a second during a modulatory sequence. We can actually find this material through the variation work conducted with the C material in the first prelude. If we inspect C, and break it down to its fundamental parts, we find that it consists of the following: an upwards scale, an appoggiatura, and a downward leap. If the order is rearranged, starting with a leap, followed by the upward scale motion, and ending with the appoggiatura, we get this transformation. Found in the first prelude as well as scattered everywhere in the opera. If we now diminish the descending interval into a fifth and omit the appoggiatura, we get this material. I still find it apt to categorize these materials as two different ones, as this D material is treated as its own entity and is an individual subject for transformation throughout the opera. But I still found it vital to point out that the fusion, soon to be revealed, is a synthesis of the C material's own descendant, which is just wild. Before we move on, let's look at a last and probably the most beautiful representation of the D material. Notice the timelessness of this particular surface structure, created by the displacement of the leitmotifs in relationship to the syncopated pulsating cellos, who blend their strokes with the sustained notes of the viola. Secondly, how beautifully the leitmotifs is traded between the woodwind section and the horns, continually reshaping the spectral contour of the leitmotif. I even forgot to mention how the alternating bass notes are also displaced in relationship to the leitmotif, increasing the ambiguity of what an audible beat even is in this section. It's rare in music to have such internal complexity and overlap in variance and arrive at something so stationary and frozen. Again, one of my personal favorites. Now finally familiar with both C and D, we can somewhat experience what their synthesis means to us in the upcoming example. When it comes to the C material, the permutation we are interested in is the second one as it appears in the first prelude. So it's not this, but it's varied repetition. For reference, here is the D material. To connect the two into a new unit, one note is added in between, welding the two together. Let's hear it now, one of the main motifs heavily used and varied in the love duet of the second act. For some people, hearing this Leitmotific-Fusion might not amount to much, but I can promise you that if you as a listener have created a relationship with its parts, it is experienced as an absolute sublime moment in the opera. Alright, let's leave C and D here for now and backtrack yet again to find the next unique motif to appear in the first prelude, E. This is a tricky one, namely because it appears here as a quite inconspicuous bass line, although Wagner clearly leaves a memory of it in the listener by emphasizing it with a crescendo. What catches our attention is the motivic development that goes on in the upper voices. But in this first excerpt of the E material, listen only to the lower voices of the counterpoint and relate to it not only as a harmonic consequence, but as the leitmotif that it is. Let's look at this material in contrapuntal relationship with other ones in all of the three acts. Notice in this first example, preceding Isolde and Tristan's meeting in the first act, how the E material coincides with the tail of the B motif, creating an ominous gesture before each initiation of the brass. Furthermore, when viewing the particular instrumentation, how Wagner utilizes the lower instruments of the orchestra in this section, pairing timpani with the horn, lower strings with bass clarinet and bassoon, and trombone and trumpet in the lower register, to situate three active layers contributing to the surface structure. In Act 2, I want to point out a less ear-catching example, where the implementation of this material grows out of an A-flat pedal note from the double basses, that then gets picked up by the bassoons for one execution of the E material, to then be transferred back to the double basses, leading the music down to a low E note, through a second execution of the material. There's a lot of lovely leitmotific work going on between Isolde, the oboe, the clarinet, and the upper strings, but for this example, try to focus only on the more humble lower voices, sliding in and out of focus. It's one of those hidden gems. Lastly, I would like to cover a sequence where 4 of these motifs are interlinked, meaning that every initiation of E occurs at the last note of the previous motif, traveling through the orchestra from bassoon, bass clarinet, and trombone down to tuba and lastly the double basses. The place in the opera where this motif is operating alone, clearly at the front of the musical surface structure. Next, let's look at a motif that could be viewed as represented in its final form only at the end of the opera, and work our way there. Here is a varied version of it appearing at the height of Isolde's climax in the beginning of the second act. Although Isolde is part of the phrase initially, try to primarily focus on the upper woodwinds and strings to follow its sequential descent. In the first scene of the third act, it reappears as a reminiscence during Tristan's descent into madness and ultimately death. A subconscious memory of Isolde's devotion is summoned at a lower, yet again almost timeless tempo, without its vigor and ecstasy, sinking into a grueling dissonance. It's the only place it ever appears in relationship to Tristan, and it's so perfectly placed at the same point in the form of the third act as where it appeared in the Isoldes climax of the second act. Here is an example of the material sped up, rhythmically diminished, and sequentially transposed in an ascending manner when Isolde and Tristan first meet in the second act. Again, listen to the woodwinds and the upper strings. So what happens to this F motif instead of sequentially continuing its way downwards like this? If instead the first statement is repeated. And conjoined with this material from the prelude. Well, this happens. I would like to engage in a different type of monologue for a minute because I think it's apt here. We discover more and more correlation between this opening prelude and the material as they appear and transform throughout the opera. In fact, almost every leitmotif is present here in this first 10-minute prelude. Since all of these materials get their own meaning and transformational life during the opera, returning to this first prelude after identifying each leitmotif creates an infinitely enriched listening experience. We no longer hear a seemingly arbitrary yet beautiful surface structure that touches in an ambiguous way. We hear synthesis of vital symbolic building blocks chained together, overlapping and developing. We both consciously and subconsciously make connections to future versions of the material. We get to appreciate the surface as a whole and its constituent parts at the same time, which is really what counterpoint is all about. I'll end the video here, it's already grown too long, and to delve into even more intricate surface structures, especially in Act 3, would require introducing a whole new set of motifs. If you made it this far, listening with care and attention, I offer you my deepest thanks. I really hope this exploration helped you hear something anew in this inexhaustible work, and perhaps inspired you to bring the same kind of listening to other music. Until next time, thank you for listening, truly.